Hello, this is Nick Shaw, the senior historian at History Made Simply. Now, I have a BA Hons in history, but more importantly, for today's subject, I have a master's degree in 20th century military history. Why is this important? Well, because we're going to be discussing the outbreak of World War I, why it started, and this is still, more than 100 years after the event, this is still a very contentious issue amongst historians. There are those who blame bad diplomacy. There are those who are saying that economics are to blame. But actually, I would say personalities are what brought on First World War. Now, it's important to realise that by the middle of the first decade, that's i.e. 1900 to 1905, by the middle of the first decade of the 20th century, Europe, still the dominant force in world affairs, Europe was divided into two armed camps. This came about largely because the French tried to throw their weight about at the beginning of the 1870s. Beginning of the 1870s, the French declared war on what was then Prussia, and the result was they were absolutely, totally defeated. And when the peace treaty was agreed, so at the same time that the peace treaty was signed between France and Prussia, the King of Prussia declared himself Emperor of a German state. Now, that German state included places like Bavaria, which was Catholic, but Prussia, which was Protestant. So it wasn't religious, it was to do with politics and military power. So a new empire, a new European empire had come into being. Now, unlike the existing empires, the French, the Russian and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the German Empire was already a highly organised industrial state. It was also being guided by arguably one of the great political personalities of the 19th century, Bismarck. Now, Bismarck had realised quite some time ago, at the beginning of the 1850s, that a German state was required. And he tried in 1848 to bring about a German state, but he failed to do so. Now, this might seem a long way from 1914, but the German state, which actually was declared in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles in 1870-71, was economically too big and too powerful for the rest of Europe, because Germany at this stage had no colonies to speak of, unlike the France, which had many colonies already by the early 1870s. Austro-Hungary had a large holding in the Balkans. The Turks had a substantial empire in the Near East. And of course, there was, sitting in magnificent isolation, the empire on which the sun never set, the British Empire, which was by far the largest in the world and would become the largest in the world. And at one stage had virtually a quarter of the world's landmass and a quarter of the world's population under its control. But Britain was frankly largely uninterested in Europe. I don't mean by that the Foreign Office wasn't interested. The Foreign Office was in Europe. But the average Briton thought what went on across the Channel was really their business. Our business was, to some extent, shouldering the white man's burden and exploiting the ownership of Canada, India, a considerable part of Africa, and not forgetting Australia and New Zealand, and dozens of other colonies. Now, Britain was already economically, to some extent, past its best. Britain had been called, 40 years before the 1870s, been called the workshop of the world, which it was. However, this phrase, workshop of the world, which was coined by Disraeli, then followed by another sentence, saying that whilst we were the workshop of the world, this was not something that the other European states would tolerate for long. And they were correct. And Germany was the leading state that had exploited what might be called the Second Industrial Revolution. The Second Industrial Revolution involved much more complex manufacturing than the first industrial revolution, which Britain had really that taken place almost completed by 1820. So Britain wasn't exactly fading, but it was now starting to make its money from being the world's banker, the world's insurer, and the world's moneylender. It didn't have a very large army. It did have one large army. It had the Anglo-Indian Army. It still had the world's largest, and it was larger than the next two navies put together. It had the world's largest navy, and it was still transporting 40% of the world's goods around the world. So it was one of the dominant players, possibly the dominant player. Certainly, the coming superstate of the United States certainly considered Great Britain to be top dog at the end of the 19th century, towards the end of the 19th. So how did Europe become an armed camp? Well, when Bismarck unified Germany, he realized that there was a problem. There was a strategic problem. You only need to look at the map. The problem with Germany is that it doesn't really have defendable borders, because it has the west of Germany, you have the Rhine, large river, but get acrossable, and to the east you have again rivers that were defendable but could be got across. But in between those two, in between the eastern border of the German Empire and the western border, it's pretty flat. There are mountains in Germany, but they're in the south of Germany. They're in Bavaria, and really Bavaria only led you to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And it stood to reason that as they spoke German, they were likely to be allied to Germany. But to the east, there was Russia, and to the west, there was France. France fed up because it had lost Alsace and Lorraine, two quite important provinces, to Germany in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. And nobody really knew what the Russians could do or would do. In any event, Bismarck knew that he had to keep the Russians and the French apart, and he did this very successfully until the beginning of the 1890s, when the French and the Russians realized that they had a number of things in common. Firstly, the French were Russia's bankers because the British Empire was shut off. Most of the French Empire was what today we would call the Third World, and so French finance needed to find fruitful customers, while the Russians were constantly in need of money and had plenty of natural resources. So France and Russia entered into a defence treaty. That defence treaty was called the Entente Cordiale. Now, the Entente Cordiale posed a threat to Germany. They could be attacked on both frontiers simultaneously. So Germany began to formalise relation with other powers, and they set up a treaty which involved the Austro-Hungarian Empire and also involved Italy, both of which were weak powers but had a biggish population. Now, the other thing that we need to realise is that the second half of the 19th century saw a massive expansion of railways throughout Western and Central Europe, and the Germans in particular were quite keen on the idea of building a railway from Berlin to Baghdad in Iraq. In theory, nobody controlled Iraq. However, as oil became increasingly important, the British realised that they needed to control at least southern Iraq, which is where the oil was. And so a company called British Petroleum, BP, was set up to do that. The Germans started to develop good relations with Turkey, which were nominally the controllers of Iraq. So really, that is where the concept of an armed camp in Europe came from. Economics and what came to be called autarky. Autarky means that you have to have absolute control over necessary raw material resources. And although oil was not an autarkic substance until 1900, very soon after 1900, it became a very important natural resource to have access to. There was very little oil other than in Romania. There was very little oil to be found in general in Europe. But it's important to remember that Britain had access not only to oil in the Americas, but it also had oil in Trinidad. It had oil in the Far East. Admittedly, so did the Dutch, but the Dutch were, by this stage, very definitely a League Division 2 state. So Britain remained independent. It remained in what was called magnificent isolation, because if you control 25% of the world's surface and you control 25% of the world's population, you also are likely to control more or less every worthwhile natural resource, and Britain did. There would be times through the latter part of the British Empire when we tried to just buy things and sell things within the British Empire, not noticing, by the way, that there was an economic hyperpower developing across the Atlantic. Now, it is also important to realise that the Americans didn't realise that they were becoming an economic hyperpower. And indeed, if one reads the cringing and fawning editorials in the American newspapers at the end of the 19th century, 1896, the Queen Empress Victoria, Queen Empress of the British Empire, celebrated her Diamond Jubilee. This was not just a British event or even a British Empire event. It was a global celebration, and the editorials in American newspapers could be described as cringing. And anyway, America believed that Britain was top dog. Now, there was a new Kaiser in Germany who didn't want to accept the fact that Britain was the top dog. Germans already had by far the largest and most efficient army in Europe. But as the 19th century drew to a close, he decided that Germany also needed to compete with Britain at sea. Now, Britain really hadn't faced a threat to its naval power since Napoleon. And I don't mean Napoleon III, I mean Napoleon, the first Napoleon. First of all, they found this quite amusing, but as we moved through the first decade of the 20th century, technology also played a part. In 1903-4, the British launched a new type of battleship called the Dreadnought. Now, the Dreadnought had steam engines still using coal, but the engines were turbines. This meant that you could move a rather heavy ship, a well-armoured ship, at high speed, well into between 20 to 25 knots. That's 25 miles an hour, sea miles an hour. And this rendered the very large fleet that Britain had and the rather small fleet that the Germans had obsolete. So they developed between the now increasingly powerful economy of Germany and the British Empire a naval race. The British would lay down and construct 2 dreadnoughts. The Germans would respond by laying down and constructing 3 dreadnoughts. Also, as the first decade of the 20th century went by, they developed a further wrinkle, or 2 wrinkles, technologically speaking, in naval warfare. One was the battle cruiser. This was an even faster version of a battleship, but it was even faster because it was more lightly armoured. Now, the Admiralty, the British Admiralty, thought, well, why are the Germans developing this substantial and very modern navy? Well, they were developing it because they wanted to be able to threaten the British Empire, and the best way to do that was to threaten its command of the sea, and not only its command of the sea, but its command of the merchant shipping aspect of trade. Now, it's also important to realise that if the Germans sank a ship, a merchant ship, with one of their new battle cruisers or one of their dreadnoughts, this would not only affect British shipping, but it would affect British finances, because via Lloyd's of London, Britain was the largest maritime insurer in the world, a very important factor in British finance. Many people lived off the dividends that becoming what was called a name at Lloyd's of London gave you. So Britain did have a large army, but that large army was on the other side of the planet. It was in India. And the British didn't really favour the idea of bringing that army west. Well, anyway, not very far west. So Britain was in a bit of a quandary, strategically speaking. They thought, well, we can't beat them on land. We can beat them at sea. That was their enemies. But now we need to, perhaps we can no longer be a magnificently isolated superstate. And unbelievably, the first diplomatic move that they made was to enter into a treaty of alliance with Japan. Why did they do this? Because Britain had major trading interests in China. It had very large investments in its colonies in Southeast Asia, in Malaya, very large investment in the important port of Singapore, and of course there were the trade routes to Australia and New Zealand to take into account. And of course there was that money-making machine, Hong Kong. So we can see why Japan was an important to get on side, because the Japanese were developing also a modern navy, and Britain realised that it could not afford to maintain a substantial navy in the Mediterranean, the North Sea and the Atlantic, and a further one in Far East. So we're left now with a situation where the British realise that they cannot be globally powerful. They can be strong in home waters, they can be strong in the Mediterranean. They can't be strong everywhere. They just don't have the financial resources, nor are they willing to raise taxation so that they could have the naval resources to be strong everywhere. Also, we have to remember that America was again developing a modern and powerful navy, and it wasn't clear what they would do with it. And certainly it wasn't clear that they would be either an ally or neutral if it came to warfare of any sort in the Atlantic, or for example the Caribbean, where there were a lot of British colonies, or South America, where the British exercised what might be called informal empire. The British owned Argentina. Now when I say owned, I mean we owned banks, a lot of the agricultural industry, the railways, the telegraph system. So really the Argentinian economy couldn't function without British know-how and, more importantly, British money. There were other states where, to a greater or lesser extent, this was important. So Britain had its formal empire. It had India, it had the dominions of Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and indeed South Africa. But again, there were bits of South Africa that we didn't control. And unfortunately, it was the good bits that we didn't control, because in the late 19th century, the world's largest deposits of gold and of diamonds were discovered in the bits of South Africa we didn't control. Again, British investors and British mining companies rushed to develop these financially highly rewarding resources, but they were under the control of independent states, the Orange Free State and the Transvaal, which were controlled by former Dutch settlers, now third, fourth, fifth generation Dutch settlers, called the Boers. Now, we'd already fought one minor colonial war with the Boers, which had been not Britain's finest military hour, shall we say, and gradually tensions built up. Now, again, railways were important globally, and they were important in southern Africa. Unfortunately, Transvaal and the Orange Free State suffered from one weak. They were landlocked, in other words, they didn't have a port. But their next door neighbour, Mozambique, was a colony of Portugal. Now, although Portugal's its oldest ally, they were only too happy to help build a railway from the major port of Mozambique into the Transvaal. And then the Transvaal built a line into the Orange Free State, ensuring that gold and diamonds did not have to flow through British-controlled lands south of the Orange Free State and the Transvaal. This indirectly led to a war of acquisition, the Second Boer War, which was conducted from 1899 to 1902. Now, to start with, surprisingly, the British did rather badly until they brought in the two best generals of the British Empire, Lord Roberts and Herbert Kitchener. Kitchener had just finished adding the Sudan to the British Empire and had stopped the French creating a barrier across the entire African continent to a British imperial idea, which was to create a railway that would be running through British-controlled and owned territory from the Cape, i.e. Cape Town, to Cairo, and then on to Alexandria. This was an important concept, important to the now extremely wealthy British settlers in the Cape Province, extremely wealthy because of the gold and the diamonds and other natural resources that were coming out of southern Africa. And the British Empire really changed somewhat, and it changed because of these, again to some extent, the South African wealthy traders. The most important one of them was called Cecil Rhodes. Now, Rhodes was, if you like, the person who really envisaged this railway from Cape Town to Cairo and onwards. Of course, it's important to remember that Britain controlled the Suez Canal. So really, had we pressed ahead with Cecil Rhodes's ideas, Britain would have controlled Africa, frankly, because we'd got the good bits, and the good bits would be connected by this enormously long railway. In any event, neither the French nor the Germans were terribly happy. The Germans had had some colonies in Africa. They had what is now known as Tanzania, but was called Tanganyika in those days, and they had Namibia. It wasn't called Namibia, it was called German Southwest Africa. So actually these colonies were not particularly valuable, but they did give the Emperor of Germany, the Kaiser, status. They gave him what he described as a place in the sun. So we can begin to see why a series of interlocking defensive treaties were made between the French, the Russians, who both feared German expansion in Europe, and the British, who realised that their new license to print money, South Africa, entirely under their control after the Boers had lost the Second Boer War, they realised that the Germans were not going to sit still and watch the sun continue to never set on the British Empire. So the British entered into informal, and I stress informal, arrangements, defence arrangements with the French and the Russians. Equally, the Germans entered into formal defence relations with Austro-Hungary and Italy. So this is why, as we come into the beginning of the second decade of the 20th century, i.e. 1910 onwards, we have a situation where Europe is developing into an armed camp. We have a naval race going on between Britain and Germany. We have a disturbed part of southeastern Europe, the Balkans, where the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Russian Empire are vying for control. And we have the French annoyed because they've lost two rather wealthy provinces in Alsace and Lorraine. And indeed, had you been a French schoolchild in the first decade of the 20th century, you would have seen Alsace and Lorraine deployed as French provinces on your map. That was, the French just were not going to accept the result of the Franco-Prussian War, 1870. Now, it's also important to realise that not only were there massive technological developments going on at sea with the development of the dreadnought battleship and the battlecruiser, and indeed the submarine, but they were also going on land. Other than Britain, which had a small professional army and a very large professional army out in South Asia, in India, the other states, the other European states, were developing enormous armies. Armies now, in Napoleonic times, an army of 100,000 plus men was considered to be pretty substantial. Now we're talking about armies running into the millions of men, both the French army, the German army, the Austro-Hungarian army, and the Russian army. So there was a land arms race as well. Now, it was no longer the case that your armed forces had to be full of well-trained, multi-year men to function. The concept of conscription had arrived in Europe in the middle of the 19th century. And what happened was that a proportion of young men coming up to the age of 18 spend a year, 2 years actually in the army. They would then be, other than those that wanted to pursue a career in the army as their way of earning a living, they would then, the ones that didn't, and that was most people, were transferred to the reserves and probably got a week of refresher training annually. Gradually, what this meant was, it meant that as you were building up bigger and bigger reserves, the size of the armies, potentially, if they mobilised for war, would be enormous and would certainly run into millions of men. So this was the case with, again, the usual European suspects. It was the case with Germany, it was the case with Russia, France, Austro-Hungary. To an extent, it was also the case with Turkey, or the Ottoman Empire as it was then, and other more minor states. So that's why by 1914 we arrive at a situation where Europe is an armed camp, and a very well armed camp, with one exception, and that's Russia. Russia had neither the industrial infrastructure or the railway system to support the huge army that it would field if it mobilised. Now, it's important to realise that in the rest of Europe, going west from Russia, and remember at this stage Russia also controlled Poland, it controlled Finland, it controlled the Ukraine, of course, and it controlled other bits of that these days people cannot believe were ever controlled by Russia, west of Poland as well, or certainly south and west of Poland. So there were all these large armies, which could be made much larger quickly by calling up the reserves. Now, very large armies create quite big logistic problems. What to do with your very large army? Who were your enemies? Well, the German General Staff developed very detailed plans for dealing with this problem. And they realised that, as we've said earlier, strategically, they had a big problem. They were going to be faced with a war on two fronts. They were going to be faced with a war from the west, from the French, and they were going to be faced with a war from the east, from Russia, both of whom were not very fond of Germany, shall we say. Now, Russia also had interests in the Balkans. Why? The Russians are Slavs, and large numbers of the people who live in the Balkans are Slavs. Russia had the Eastern Orthodox Church. Large numbers of the Slavs living in the Balkans belonged to the Eastern Orthodox Church. Russia felt that it had like what might be called a pan-Slav interest in the Balkans. The Germans, as we've already stated, were keen on developing a railway system, particularly as oil became more important. They were keen on developing a railway system from Berlin to Baghdad. The British were still living in magnificent isolation. But the magnificent isolation came to an end when the two as it were, anti-German states, France and Russia, entered into a formal treaty, which actually took place towards the end of the 1890s, and that just made, if you like, the paranoia in Germany much worse. Now, in the early 1900s, Britain informally joined that formal arrangement, that formal treaty the French and the Russians entered into. Britain had only two legal diplomatic treaties. One was the treaty previously mentioned with the Japanese, because we just couldn't afford to maintain a substantial navy in the Far East, as well as one in the Mediterranean and one covering the North Sea and the Atlantic. And surprisingly, and this was a leftover from the early 19th century, Belgium. Britain, in theory, with other major European states, guaranteed the independence of Belgium. Now, this was fine, until, of course, the Germans began to realise that they needed war plans that involved reducing their strategic worry of war on two fronts to one. And the German General Staff was undoubtedly the best organised army brain in the world. And the head of the German staff, a general called Count von Stauffen, developed a plan. The plan involved knocking the French out in 90 to 120 days from war being declared, and then transferring the bulk of the forces to face the Russians, who had, as we've already stated, although they had a very large army, they had a very underdeveloped railway system, so it wasn't possible to move their army, it wasn't possible to muster their army quickly, and it wasn't possible to move that mustered army quickly either. Now, surprisingly, if you go to central and southwestern Germany, i.e. the Rhineland, west of the Rhine, you will see that the stations have enormously long, that is mirrored in northeastern France. The railway stations there have enormously long platforms. Why? Because from the development of railway systems in Western and Central Europe, movement from your base to where the battles were going to be fought was done by railway, and you needed trains, enormously long trains, to carry these millions of troops to the front. Now, of course, once they got off the train, basically we were back in Napoleonic times. Artillery was pulled by heavy horses. There was a very, very small element of motorized transport, largely for senior officers. That was it. Other than that, armies marched on their feet. So they required good roads. There were good roads in much of Western Europe now by 1914, but they weren't large enough to carry the enormous number of the armies that Germany, Austro-Hungary, France, and particularly the Russians had developed. And let me give you an example. Once they got off these very long railway platforms and formed up, a German army corps. Now, an army corps is often composed of 3 infantry divisions, that's about 50 to 60,000 men, some cavalry, probably a brigade of cavalry, and artillery, at least 72, perhaps more, field artillery, and they, again, each gun has to be pulled by 6 horses. So we're talking about, once you sort of put all these men on the good roads, we're talking that actually the 50 to 60,000 men, plus the horses, plus the guns, plus of course the supply chain. You know, they had to take the ammunition with them. They had to take food with them. They couldn't live off the land as Napoleon's armies had. They had other logistical infrastructure because they had hospitals to take with them. So a German army corps, 3 infantry divisions plus cavalry plus artillery plus other logistics, took up a lot of space on a good road. And in fact, they took up 27 kilometres. In other words, 27 kilometres was roughly what you would expect that army corps of 3 divisions to move in a day. Now, when they got up after they had breakfast, they'd broken the camp and were ready to move out, and they'd formed up. The vanguard, i.e. the troops at the front of the column, would walk 27 kilometres that day, and the rear guard, the last troops in that corps, would reach where the vanguard had started. So a division, in fact an army corps, took up 27 kilometres of road. Sounds like, well, that's not a problem. But actually, if you've got 100 plus divisions divided into 30 infantry corps, plus logistics, plus cavalry divisions as well, you're talking about a lot of road space. You're talking actually, if they're all like ready to march off and they're standing on Tarmac Adam Road, we're talking about 1,000 kilometres of road. Now, because Belgium was much of Belgium was quite industrialised, there was a fair amount of Tarmac Adam Road. Also, Luxembourg, fair amount of Tarmac Adam Road. Northeastern France, also fair amount of Tarmac Adam Road by 1914. But this vast number of troops, horses, guns, supplies, it required organisation. You couldn't just get them put them on the trains and get them off the trains and just let them loose. No, they had to get off the train in a certain order, and they had to march off in a certain order. And this was what the armies of the major and minor states of Europe had to organise in 1914. And in order to do that, they had what was called a general staff. And the general staff had to organise things meticulously because it was no good them just arriving in any old order. You wanted certain formations to march off and engage the enemy first, and then you wanted them supporting. And eventually you would have what the Germans called the Schwerpunkt. That's the point of maximum effort. All of this required enormous numbers of orders, and the Germans developed under Count Schlieffen. They developed the Schlieffen Plan. Now, what the Schlieffen Plan ensured was that the right troops would arrive at the right place on the German border, and then they would cross the German border and enter Belgium and northeastern France and Luxembourg in a given order, and that they would be supplied properly, that they would have, there would be a number of hospitals following them, there would be supply columns following them, and they would all be in the right place at the right time. Now, the French were somewhat less well organised, but they also had detailed war plans for their army. They could muster their army, get it off the trains, and get it moving. But the points of maximum effort were very, very different. Schieffen's plan was to invade neutral Belgium and Luxembourg and northeastern France, but his concept was an enormous westward and then southwestward swinging movement, so that the capital of France, Paris, would be cut off from the bulk of France. In other words, he intended to move his armies west, then southwest, then when they got immediately south of Paris, he would turn northeast. And of course, that would entrap the bulk of the French army against the blocking force that the French army wanted to attack in Alsace and Lorraine. So the French plan actually fitted quite nicely with Count Schlieffen's ideas, in that they put the largest amount of their forces in northeastern France, that's north and east of Paris, because they wanted to attack into Alsace-Lorraine and Germany. Now, the plans were incredibly detailed. The Russians less so. The Austro-Hungarians, again, surprisingly, they had probably the most flexible plan. Neither the French nor the Germans decided to keep a strategic reserve. They put everything in the shop window, so to speak. So all their forces were deployed either defending the Belgian and Luxembourg border or attacking into Alsace-Lorraine and Germany. The Germans, we've already said, they had this concept of a sweeping movement to cut Paris off from the rest of France and to pin the bulk of the French armies against the blocking force of the German army left in Alsace-Lorraine and southeastern Germany, or the Rhineland anyway. Now you might ask, well, what was the British Army do? Well, the British Army, as we've said, the Germans had 100 plus divisions, French had 100 plus divisions, the Russians had far more than that, the Austro-Hungarians had 100 plus divisions, but they weren't deploying them all in an immediate attack. The Austro-Hungarians had to think that they had the Germans as their allies, the Russians were going to be their principal enemy, but they had other enemies. They had Serbia, for example. They had Romania, possibly as an enemy. Bulgaria, possibly as an enemy. Which is why the Austrian General Staff kept a strategic reserve, because they didn't know where things were going to go wrong, and they wanted to be able to reinforce where things were going wrong. Everybody else has got everything in the shop window. So what were the British going to do? Well, actually, when we went to war with the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians, and theoretically with the Italians, but the Italians decided to wait and see, which was sensible, bearing in mind that they were one of the weakest economies in Europe, and they couldn't really afford to fight a war. So, the British Army. How big was the British Army? How big was the British Army we could send to the continent? Well, it was a magnificent 6 divisions. So remember that Germans had 100 plus divisions, the French had 100 plus divisions. So it's hardly surprising that the Kaiser described the British Army as contemptible. It was a tiny fraction, about 5% the size of most European armies. It had one thing going for it. It was made up of regulars, in other words, people that fought wars for a living and weren't just trained for a couple of years and then joined up the reserves maybe once a year in the summer for a week or 2 weeks, which is what the European armies did. No, we had guys who were using their rifle on rifle ranges 5 days a week, 52 weeks a year. So the British Army was tiny, but it was extremely efficient. Anyway, so Britain had declared war on Germany. The Russians and the French declared war on Germany and on Austro-Hungary. The British also declared war on Austro-Hungary. Not that there was a great deal they could do about making war with Austro-Hungary, except they wanted to bottle the Austro-Hungarian fleet up in the Adriatic, which they did. So, what happened when these huge forces bumped into each other? Well, the fighting was fierce, and it was fairly clear within probably the first 10 or 15 days that tactically power lay in the hands of the person defending. Why was this? Well, there was a new form of artillery start that the British had brought into use in many of their colonial wars, and it's what we today would call a machine gun. Now, a machine gun can fire as much as 100 men with a rifle, equipped with rifles could. The rifles also had advanced substantially. Rifles were fed by a magazine with 15 rounds in it, 15 bullets, and at least the divisions that were made up of either regular troops or troops who had just completed their training, they could use these rifles pretty well. But machine guns were almost a whole new thing, and German regiments had 4 to 6 machine guns, British regiments 2 machine guns, and French regiments, again, I think had 4 to 6. So the amount of firepower that a defending unit could throw down range had increased dramatically from 1870, absolutely dramatic. And the British had learnt, as Sir Arthur Conan Doyle put it, no end of a lesson when fighting the Boers. The Boers were an amateur army, but an amateur army manned by people who were very good with a rifle. They had to be, because they had to defend. Most Boers lived in rough country, and they had to be able to defend themselves. So they were good shots. The small British army, very good shots, and could fire rapidly and very accurately. So what we're talking about is if you're advancing into a much heavier amount of firepower than had been the case, for example, in 1870. And one arm of the armed forces that all the European states had was cavalry. Now, cavalry was considered the elite, but as became immediately apparent, a regiment of cavalry, say 400 to 500 cavalrymen, could be annihilated in a few minutes by a machine gun or 2 machine guns and 800 riflemen who could fire fairly accurately and were equipped with magazine-loaded rifles. And there were numerous occasions in the early couple of months of World War I where entire regiments of cavalry were wiped out. On not just German cavalry advancing, but British cavalry, French cavalry. The French cavalry was Napoleon. They were still Napoleonic in nature. The heavy cavalry. They were wearing armored breastplates, and they had horses which most other armies were using for pulling medium and field artillery. So the cavalry, what was called the arme blanche, the white arm of the armed forces, was utterly ineffective. Within 6 weeks of the war breaking out, it was also apparent that something else was happening, and that something else involved trenches. Now, the Germans certainly thought that trenches would be a requirement. For example, they would require their forces in Alsace and Lorraine to dig trenches because they were going to stand on the defensive. But they did not consider that trenches would form an important part of battlefield management. But of course, as we all know, trenches, particularly when covered in their front in barbed wire, proved to be virtually impossible for infantry and certainly for the cavalry to pass without enormous backing from artillery. This was something which actually careful students of the American Civil War, the Second Boer War and the Russian-Japanese War would have been, or should have been aware of. The British made extensive use of barbed wire and of trenches in the Boer War. Almost all of the land warfare conducted by the Russians and the Japanese in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 was around a Russian-held port, which eventually, with fanaticism and tremendous casualties, the Japanese took. So warfare was not that which the general staffs of each country had been planning for. It became an industrialized struggle which would consume the lives of millions of Europeans. Millions. And indeed, after the early War of Movement, there was a race to build trenches all the way from the Swiss border to the English Channel. And within 3 months of the war starting, there was an unbroken line of trenches from the Swiss border to the English Channel. And yes, there would be some movement, but very little. Millions of men would die gaining a few hundred yards of ground. But it wasn't until the arrival of both new tactics and new forms of fighting war, namely the tank, which began to come into use in 1917. It simply was there simply was too much defence on both the German and the Anglo-French sides to cause any breakthrough in the trench warfare system. So we see how this system of treaties, so-called defensive treaties, but actually they were offensive treaties, led to a system where millions of men were tied down in trenches and barbed wire. Now, on the Eastern Front, that is the Russians versus the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians, it was somewhat different because we're talking about much bigger space, geographic spaces. We're not talking 500, 600 miles of trench systems. We're talking from the Baltic to the Carpathian Mountains, over 1,000 miles. So neither the Central Powers, that is Germany and Austro-Hungary, nor the Russians could muster enough force to defend that in the way that the Western Front was defended. And warfare there did involve movement. Gradually the Russians lost control of Poland, and they lost control of part of the Baltic states, and they lost control of parts of the Ukraine. Had they had a well-organized state and well-organized industries, this would not have been the end. But they had neither. That's the Russians. The Russians were poorly equipped. Indeed, there were times in the war where one rifle was being shared by 3 infantrymen, and they had an inability to develop industries quickly and efficiently to produce enough weaponry to fight a type of war that the First World War was. So it probably comes as no surprise to learn that in 1917, the state that has hundreds and hundreds of years, certainly since the 15th century, under Tsars, collapsed. But that is a story for another day. So we leave Europe entrenched, in essence, and a search for a way out of the stalemate. Thanks very much for listening.
Don't forget to like and subscribe to our